Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Odd Week Sunday School, not Summer Sunday School. We're going to continue meeting this way every Sunday that's on an odd date through the fall, a little ways anyway, and we'll meet at 10 o'clock on Sunday mornings or thereafter on our church website or YouTube or Facebook. So join us when you can. This fall, I'm going to use lessons from the lectionary readings that are assigned for each Sunday. It's an interesting way to read the Bible, the lectionary. You get several readings for each day that sort of echo each other from Old Testament, New Testament, Gospel, and Psalms. And if you'd be interested in reading the lectionary readings, not just for Sundays, but for every single day of the week, you can find them on our website. They're newly refreshed every day, the lectionary readings for each day, and they're under Ministry and Bible Study, so you'll find them on that tab. Today's lectionary reading, the one we're going to use, is from the first Gospel, the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 18, the end of that chapter, and it's a section on forgiveness, the story of the unmerciful servant. You might have heard of it. One of the things to keep in mind about this chapter is that it's kind of a church instruction manual. It contains several stories that are pretty famous about how people should treat each other according to Jesus. But the context actually right there is the faith community. And in fact, in the New Revised Standard Version of the Bible, which I'm going to read from today, twice we get the translation, member of the church. How should I treat my fellow church member? A word translated from the Greek word for brother. And in this context, this is appropriate. So interesting to think that this advice or these rules from Jesus really pertain to how we treat each other in our faith community. So this is a story about forgiveness. And you've heard it before, probably, but it may be interesting to think of it in the church context. So let me read it to you. I'm going to read from Matthew chapter 18, verses 21 to 35 from the NRSV. Then Peter came and said to Jesus, "Lord, if another member of the church sins against me, how often should I forgive? As many as 7 times?" Jesus said to him, "Not 7 times, but I tell you, 77 times. For this reason, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his slaves. When he began the reckoning, one who owed him 10,000 talents was brought to him, and as he could not pay, his lord ordered him to be sold, together with his wife and children, and all his possessions, and payment to be made. So the slave fell on his knees before him, saying, 'Have patience with me, and I will pay you everything.' And out of pity for him, the lord of that slave released him and forgave him the debt. But that same slave, as he went out, came upon one of his fellow slaves who owed him 100 denarii. And seizing him by the throat, he said, 'Pay what you owe.' Then his fellow slave fell down and pleaded with him, 'Have patience with me, and I will pay you.' But he refused. Then he went and threw him into prison until he could pay the debt. And when his fellow slaves saw what had happened, they were greatly distressed, and they went and reported to their lord all that had taken place. Then his lord summoned him and said to him, 'You wicked slave, I forgave you all that debt because you pleaded with me. Should you not have had mercy on your fellow slave as I had mercy on you?' And in anger his lord handed him over to be tortured until he would pay his entire debt. And so my heavenly Father will also do to every one of you if you do not forgive your brother or sister from your heart." Okay, the parable of the unmerciful servant, as it's known. This one appears only in Matthew, and it's in this chapter, as I said, kind of about how to treat members of our faith community. Here are the other things that have happened in the chapter before this story, so the context. The first thing that happens is that Peter comes, some of the disciples come and ask Jesus, "Who's first in the kingdom of heaven? Which of us is first?" To which the answer from Jesus is children, or those who humble themselves like children. Next comes Matthew's version of the lost sheep story that ends this way. Jesus says, "Your Father in heaven is not willing that any of these little ones should be lost." Then we get an interesting section on how to treat a fellow church member who's done us a wrong, who's done something to us. And here the answer is you're supposed to go and confront this friend or this brother and explain how you feel about it and see if you can reconcile and it can be put right. And if it can't be, then you bring a few other people with you. You try again for some mediation. And if you fail again, then you have to put some distance between you. That's important part. And then we get this story about Peter asking this question, a kind of a technical question: how many times am I supposed to forgive my fellow church member? So let's think about 3 questions in connection with this parable. How many times are we supposed to forgive our fellow church member? What motivates forgiveness in this story? And third, does God's forgiveness depend on us doing something? How many times? Take that one first. You know, Peter draws this whole parable out of Jesus by asking that question: how many times am I supposed to forgive somebody? Why did Peter ask this question? To me, it kind of sounds like one of those questions where you're hoping that the answer is going to get you off the hook. He even suggested, 7 times, Lord? Am I supposed to forgive my brother 7 times? Which right there, that's kind of a generous offer on Peter's part, because teachings of the day generally talked about 3 times it was necessary to forgive. But Jesus came back with 77 times. And in some translations, it's 7 times 70. Apparently, it's not possible to be sure which the Greek means. So if you're going to take a very literal approach to how many times do I forgive another person, another church member, another brother, then the answer is either 77 times, and on 78 you're free, or 490 times, and 491st time you don't have to. And I have heard this text preached exactly that way. Some people believe we should read this quite literally. There is another way to read it, which is to say that oftentimes in parables or in the Bible, in stories of Jesus, there is hyperbole, meaning exaggeration. And there is quite a bit of exaggeration elsewhere in this story. For example, the 10,000 talents of debt that the servant has toward his Lord, that's a fantastical, impossible number. There's literally no way that a servant could rack up that kind of a debt. There's no way he could pay it, but you can't even imagine what he was doing to incur such a debt. That 10,000 talents means the debt was enormous and unpayable. So another way to understand how many times is, especially since 7 is a biblical number of completeness, enough times, completely. Not really an accounting assignment. Its spirit of the answer is as many times as it takes. The second point we want to think about in this story is what motivates forgiveness. And I think this is interesting too, because the word here is that what motivated the king to forgive the debt in the parable was pity. He took pity on the servant. Some people will say that pity's different from compassion. Maybe in English there's a nuance there that's different. But the fact is both those English words are used to translate the Greek word that is here. So pity or compassion. And that Greek word, I am told, is from the Greek word for guts or bowels. And you can kind of see why the NRSV didn't put it that way. It's not very poetic. But it does tell you how deeply this emotion or this feeling is supposed to be that motivates forgiveness. Compassion or feeling for someone from deep inside. We often talk about how difficult forgiveness is in real life. This is a conversation we've all had and a thing we've all confronted. But it could be that it's not really the forgiveness that's the hard thing. It's that we aren't really very compassionate toward the person who has offended us. We aren't really putting ourselves in his or her shoes. If we were, and we could really feel it the way they feel it, then maybe the forgiveness would be easier. And then there's that final twist, and lots of times we don't like this part of the story. We like to believe that God's forgiveness, the forgiveness of the Lord in this story, if we're thinking that maybe this is a reference to God's forgiveness, is absolutely free and undeserved and wholehearted and comes to us, repeatedly. But in this parable, our hero, the forgiven servant, who's about to become the unmerciful servant, grabs his fellow servant, by the throat and tells him he's got to pay up right away a very, very small debt. A few denarii is a ridiculously small number for then him to be thrown into debtor's prison for. So that's another piece of exaggeration in this story. And the words are exactly parallel that are used. The second servant pleads with the first servant, and the first servant is not merciful. Now, the thing is, to go back to this idea about it's within the faith community, there's a lot of other people who see this. There are other people that know about it. So it's in a context of a community. And the unmerciful servant doesn't get away with treating his fellow servant this way, his fellow debtor, because everybody sees it and goes back and reports to the Lord about it. And then the king does something really dramatic. He revokes his forgiveness and says this guy is going to be handed over to torturers, also something we don't really like to think about. Exaggeration may be the byword here as well. Interesting to ponder that. But does this part of the story really mean, is Jesus really saying here that God's forgiveness is somehow contingent on our forgiving others? Well, we say that every time we pray the Lord's Prayer, actually. Forgive us our debts as we forgive others. Maybe we should be careful about praying that. Jesus didn't put too many sentences in the Lord's Prayer, but that's one of them. Then, whatever God's ultimate judgment plan is, this is, I think, something kind of beyond human understanding. But we know this much from this story. God's forgiveness and our forgiveness of other people, they're very closely connected. They're very closely connected. Something to really bear in mind. The other lectionary story for this Sunday that I encourage you to go take a look at maybe later today comes from the book of Genesis. The Old Testament reading for today is from Genesis chapter 50, towards the end of the book, verses 15 to 21. That's the story of Joseph when he is asked by his brothers for forgiveness. And you might remember that Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers. He was treated very, very badly. And the brothers knew when their father died that they needed to go and ask this brother for forgiveness. Read that story and see what kind of forgiveness Joseph offered to his brothers. It's breathtaking, really. And that's another way to tackle the question of forgiveness and think about what the moral of the story is. It's interesting sometimes to use the Bible to interpret the Bible. Rather than going to Google, maybe dig deeper into the text and find a cross-reference like this. So the point of chapter 18 is how to treat our brothers and sisters in our faith community. And while these principles are surely applicable to other parts of our life, let's not forget that in this chapter of the gospel, it's actually connected to our church family. And in that spirit, I'll just end with a quote from Charles Campbell, one of the writers for the Feasting on the Word curriculum series. He says, "The concern here is the life of the church and the practices necessary to build up the community of faith. At the heart of those practices is forgiveness, not as an isolated act, but as an ongoing activity among members of the community. Within this context, there can be no limit on forgiveness because it is a never-ending practice that is essential to the life of the church, and maybe to other parts of our life as well." So be well until we meet again on the next Odd Week Sunday.